The crystal champagne flute slipped from my fingers, shattering against the polished marble as those words cut through the wedding reception like a blade. Here's the family burden we'll have to carry now. My new daughter-in-law announced to her circle of friends, her diamond bracelet catching the chandelier light as she gestured dismissively toward me. 200 guests turned to stare at the woman in the simple black dress standing frozen by the gift table. That's when Senator Robert Ashford's face drained of all color. My name is Catherine Matthews, and at 58, I've mastered the art of being magnificently underestimated. For the past 12 years since my husband Marcus died, I've perfected the role of the struggling widow living on Social Security and life insurance. What my son Michael's new wife didn't know was that the woman she'd just dismissed owned the very foundation funding her father's political campaigns. The wedding was everything you'd expect from Seattle's political elite. The Ashford family estate sprawled across Mercer Island like something from a magazine, complete with waterfront views and gardens that probably cost more than most people's houses. Victoria glided down the aisle in a gown that screamed old money, her blonde hair arranged in the kind of elaborate style that takes hours and costs more than my monthly grocery budget. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a black dress from Nordstrom Rack, my late mother's simple pearl earrings and comfortable flats that wouldn't draw attention. After 12 years of practice, I knew exactly how to look like what people expected a retired high school English teacher stretching her pension and trying not to be a burden on her successful son. The ceremony itself was beautiful, though I noticed Victoria's mother, Diane, studying me like I was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Her husband, Senator Ashford, barely acknowledged my presence during the receiving line, offering the kind of polite handshake politicians perfect for constituents they'll never remember. Michael looked happier than I'd seen him since his father died. At 34, he'd built a respected career as a software architect, earned his downtown condo, and found love with someone who seemed to share his values. At least that's what I'd believed until tonight. The reception was where everything shifted. The Ashfords had spared no expense, ice sculptures, a 20-piece orchestra, and enough white roses to stock a florist shop. I found myself at a corner table, nursing a glass of wine and watching my son dance with his new wife when Victoria approached with her parents and her college roommate Jessica. "Mom and Dad," she said with that syrupy tone that made my skin crawl, "I really want you to meet Michael's mother." Then came the words that changed everything. "Here's the family burden we'll have to carry now." The silence that followed felt like ice water in my veins. Jessica laughed nervously. Diane looked mortified, and Senator Ashford stared at me with dawning recognition that made my heart pound. "Catherine Matthews," he whispered, and suddenly 12 years of carefully constructed invisibility began to crumble. The morning after the wedding, I sat in my modest Capitol Hill apartment, hands wrapped around my coffee mug, watching the Seattle skyline through rain-streaked windows. My phone had been buzzing since dawn, missed calls from Michael, text messages I couldn't bring myself to read. What Victoria didn't know was that her dismissive comment had been overheard by more than just family. Among the wedding guests were 3 investigative journalists, 2 political donors, and Senator Patricia Williams from the opposing party, all of whom knew exactly who I was behind my carefully maintained facade. The rain intensified against my windows as I opened my laptop and began typing an email I'd been composing in my head for hours. It was time to remind certain people that some burdens carry more weight than others. My phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. There would be time for explanations later. Right now, I had more pressing matters to attend to. Because Catherine Matthews, the struggling widow, was about to become Catherine Matthews, the kingmaker, and Victoria Ashford was about to learn that some family burdens fight back. The first call came at 7:30 that morning from Daniel Rodriguez, my financial advisor for the past decade. His voice carried an urgency I rarely heard from the man who'd helped me transform Marcus's modest life insurance policy into something far more substantial. "Catherine, we have a situation. Someone's been asking questions about the Matthews Foundation's donor list. Professional inquiries, not casual curiosity." I set down, my coffee rain still pattering against my apartment windows. "What kind of questions?" The kind that suggests someone with serious connections is trying to trace funding sources. They're specifically interested in political contributions from the foundation over the past 5 years. The Matthews Foundation, named after my late husband, officially established as a small educational charity supporting literacy programs in underserved communities. What Daniel didn't mention, what very few people knew, was that it had grown into something much larger. Over the past 12 years, through careful investments and strategic partnerships, the foundation now controlled nearly $40 million in assets. More importantly, it was the primary funding source for the Ashford Institute for Democratic Progress, Senator Robert Ashford's pet project. Daniel, I need you to pull all financial records for the Ashford Institute contributions, everything from the past 3 years. Catherine, are you sure about this? If we're cutting funding, it's going to raise questions. I walked to my window, watching Seattle wake up below. Let them ask questions. I have a feeling we're about to get very interesting answers. After hanging up, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my old colleague from the university, Professor Elena Vasquez, who now worked as a political consultant in Washington, D.C. Catherine Matthews. Elena said, surprise evident in her voice. It's been, 5 years since we spoke? Too long. Elena, I need a favor. What do you know about Victoria Ashford's background before she married my son? There was a pause. Your son married into the Ashford family, Catherine. That's quite a connection. Give me a few hours. I'll make some calls. While waiting, I decided to take a walk through Pike Place Market, something I did when I needed to think clearly. The familiar chaos of vendors calling out prices, tourists snapping photos, and the scent of fresh fish and flowers usually calmed my mind. Today it felt different. I was no longer the invisible widow browsing for modest groceries. I was a woman with resources, connections, and growing motivation to use both. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Mom, we need to talk. Victoria feels terrible about last night. Can we have lunch? I stared at the message for a long moment before responding. Of course, sweetheart. Pick the place. 3 hours later, I sat across from my son and new daughter-in-law at Ray's Boathouse, the same restaurant where Marcus had proposed to me 36 years ago. Victoria had clearly spent considerable time preparing for this lunch. Her makeup was flawless, her designer dress carefully chosen to suggest both wealth and approachability. Catherine, I owe you such an enormous apology. Victoria began, her voice dripping with practiced sincerity. What I said last night was completely inappropriate. I was nervous, probably had too much champagne, and I spoke without thinking. I smiled gently. These things happen, dear. Wedding nerves affect everyone differently. Michael looked relieved, clearly hoping this would resolve quickly. Victoria pressed on. I hope we can start over. I'd love to get to know you better, maybe understand more about your situation so we can help where appropriate. There it was, the real purpose of this lunch. Not an apology, but reconnaissance. My situation, I asked innocently. Well, Michael mentioned you've been living on a tight budget since his father passed. I thought perhaps there might be ways our family could assist. Daddy has connections that might help with better healthcare options or housing assistance programs. I sipped my water, studying her carefully. That's very thoughtful. What kind of assistance did you have in mind? Victoria exchanged a quick glance with Michael. Nothing dramatic. Perhaps help with utilities during winter months or connecting you with senior services that might reduce some of your living expenses. Senior services. The condescension was breathtaking. My phone buzzed. A text from Elena. Call me. You need to hear this. Excuse me for just a moment, I said, standing. I need to take this call. I stepped outside onto the restaurant's deck, Seattle's harbor spreading before me like a gray canvas. Elena, what did you find? Catherine, your daughter-in-law, isn't who she appears to be. Victoria Ashford dropped out of law school 3 years ago with substantial debt. She's been essentially unemployed since then, living off her family's resources while positioning herself to marry well. My stomach tightened. Go on. More interesting, she's been researching wealthy widows in Seattle for the past 18 months. I found records of her joining various volunteer organizations, charity events, and social clubs specifically frequented by older women with money. The pieces began forming a picture I didn't want to see. Elena was my son, specifically targeted. Based on what I'm seeing, yes. She researched his background thoroughly before their first meeting. She knew he was unmarried, successful, and most importantly, that his mother lived alone and might be vulnerable to influence. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of manipulation settling over me like fog. There's more, Catherine. Victoria's been asking questions about inheritance laws, specifically regarding widows without wills and adult children who might need financial support for their parents. I thanked Elena and ended the call standing alone on the deck as the implications washed over me. My son hadn't fallen in love. He'd been hunted. When I returned to the table, Victoria was discussing potential living arrangements. "We have plenty of space in the Mercer Island house," she was saying to Michael. "Your mother could have her own wing, complete privacy, but with family nearby for support." Michael looked hopeful. "Mom, what do you think? It might be nice to have less to worry about." I sat down, slowly looking at both of their expectant faces. Victoria's smile was perfect, practiced, predatory. "That's incredibly generous," I said finally, "but I'm quite comfortable in my apartment." Victoria's smile flickered slightly. "Of course, but as you get older, Catherine, having family support becomes more important. Michael worries about you living alone." "Do you, Michael?" As I asked my son directly. He shifted uncomfortably. "Well, sometimes, especially with Dad gone, I just want to make sure you're okay." The manipulation was subtle but clear. Victoria had been working on Michael, planting seeds of concern about his aging mother's welfare, positioning herself as the caring daughter-in-law with practical solutions. "I appreciate the concern," I said carefully, "but I've been managing quite well on my own." Victoria leaned forward. "Catherine, I hope you don't think we're trying to interfere. It's just that family takes care of family. That's how the Ashfords have always operated." "And how exactly do the Ashfords take care of family?" I asked. "Well, we pool our resources, share responsibilities. Daddy always says that individual wealth means nothing if the family isn't strong together." I almost laughed. The woman who'd called me a burden 12 hours ago was now lecturing me about family unity. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Daniel. "Foundation board meeting moved to tomorrow, 2 p.m. Urgent financial decisions needed regarding Ashford Institute funding." I looked at Victoria's perfectly composed face and made a decision that would change all our lives. Victoria, you're absolutely right about family taking care of family. In fact, I have some family business to attend to tomorrow that I think might interest you very much." "What kind of business?" she asked, and for the first time, I heard genuine curiosity beneath her practiced politeness. I smiled, and this time it wasn't gentle at all. "The kind that might help you understand exactly what kind of burden you've married into." The Matthews Foundation board meeting convened at exactly 2 o'clock in the conference room of Harrison and Associates, downtown Seattle's most prestigious law firm. Victoria had insisted on attending as family support, arriving in a Navy Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She sat beside Michael, perfectly postured, while I took my place at the head of the polished conference table. What Victoria didn't expect was the caliber of people already seated around that table. "But, ladies and gentlemen," I began, "I'd like you to meet my son Michael and his wife Victoria. Victoria, these are the other board members of the Matthews Foundation." I watched her face as I made introductions. Dr. Sarah Chen, former Secretary of Education under the Clinton administration, Judge William Torres, Washington State Supreme Court, Margaret Blackwood, CEO of Pacific Northwest Bank, and our newest member, Senator Patricia Williams. Victoria's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the confusion flickering across her features. This wasn't the small charity board meeting she'd expected. No. The primary item on today's agenda, I continued, involves a significant funding decision regarding the Ashford Institute for Democratic Progress. As you all know, the Matthews Foundation has been the Institute's primary benefactor for the past 3 years, contributing $2.8 million annually. Senator Williams leaned forward. "Catherine, before we proceed, I think everyone should know about the situation that's brought this review to our attention." Victoria shifted uncomfortably beside Michael, who was staring at me with growing bewilderment. 2 nights ago at a family wedding, there was an incident that calls into question the ethical alignment between our foundation's values and the Ashford family's treatment of community members. I pulled out my phone and played a recording I'd made that morning. Victoria's voice filled the conference room. "Here's the family burden we'll have to carry now." The silence that followed was absolute. This recording, I continued, captures Mrs. Victoria Ashford publicly, dismissing a senior community member as a burden demonstrating exactly the kind of attitude our foundation was created to combat. Victoria found her voice, though it shook slightly. That was taken out of context. It was a private comment, and I apologized profusely. Judge Torres adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Ashford character isn't determined by what we say in public, but by what we believe is acceptable to say when we think no one important is listening. Dr. Chen opened a folder in front of her. Catherine, I've reviewed the Ashford Institute's recent programming, and frankly, the outcomes don't justify continued funding at current levels. What outcomes? Michael asked, finally finding his voice. Margaret Blackwood answered, Your wife's father has been using foundation money to fund political activities that fall well outside our educational charter. Rather than supporting literacy programs, much of our contribution has gone toward campaign consulting and political networking events. Victoria's composure cracked. You can't just cut funding because of a personal disagreement. There are contracts, legal obligations. I smiled. Victoria, you seem to misunderstand something fundamental. The Matthews Foundation doesn't have contracts with the Ashford Institute. We have an annual grant arrangement that's renewed at our discretion. Senator Williams pulled out her own documents. Mrs. Ashford, I've also learned some interesting things about your family's recent financial activities, specifically your attempt yesterday to research Mrs. Matthews' personal assets through private investigators. The color drained from Victoria's face completely. You hired investigators to research my mother. Michael's voice carried a dangerous edge I'd never heard before. It wasn't like that, Victoria protested. I was just trying to understand our family's situation better. By investigating my financial records without my knowledge or consent, I asked quietly. The board members exchanged glances. They'd dealt with attempted manipulation before, but rarely this blatant. Judge Torres spoke carefully. Mrs. Ashford, attempted financial investigation of a foundation board chair raises serious ethical concerns about your family's motivations regarding this funding relationship. Victoria stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. You can't punish my father's legitimate educational work because you don't like me. Actually, or Dr. Chen said, we can. The Matthews Foundation exists to support genuine educational initiatives, not to subsidize political ambitions disguised as charity work. I looked around the table at these accomplished people who'd agreed to serve on the foundation board specifically because they shared my commitment to authentic community service. The motion before us today is to terminate all funding to the Ashford Institute, effective immediately, and redirect those resources to organizations with demonstrated commitment to educational equity. All in favor? Every hand around the table rose except Victoria's and Michael's. Motion carried. Victoria sank back into her chair, her political networking strategy crumbling in real time. You can't do this. My father has commitments, obligations. People depend on that funding. Then perhaps your father should have been more careful about the character of the family members he allowed to represent his interests. Senator Williams said with surgical precision. Michael had been silent throughout the vote, processing the reality of what he'd just witnessed. Finally, he looked directly at me. Mom, who are you really at? I stood and walked to the conference room windows looking out at Elliott Bay, where ferries moved like distant memories across gray water. Michael, I'm the same person who raised you to value honesty, hard work, and treating others with dignity. The same person who taught you that character matters more than money, and that true success comes from lifting others up rather than putting them down. I turned back to face the room. I'm also someone who spent 12 years building something meaningful with the resources your father left us, something your wife just tried to destroy through manipulation and greed. Victoria finally exploded. Greed. You're sitting on millions while letting people think you need charity and you're calling me greedy. Victoria, I said calmly, I never asked anyone for charity. I never claimed to need assistance. You assumed I was vulnerable and attempted to exploit that assumption for financial gain. Dr. Chen gathered her papers. If there's no further business, I believe this meeting is concluded. As the board members filed out, each offering me quiet words of support, Victoria remained frozen in her chair. Michael sat beside her, staring at his hands. Michael, I said gently, I know this is a lot to process. He looked up at me with eyes that held equal measures of admiration and betrayal. How long have you been planning this? I wasn't planning anything until your wife decided to investigate my private affairs and publicly humiliate me. Everything that happened today was her choice, not mine. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. What happens now? I looked at this young woman who'd tried to manipulate my family, researched my finances without permission, and publicly dismissed me as a burden to be managed. Now, Victoria, you get to experience what it actually means to be married into my family. The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the next step would change everything forever. Because this, I said, gesturing to the empty conference room where her father's political ambitions had just been dismantled, this was just the beginning. The call came at 6:30 the next morning. Senator Robert Ashford's voice was barely controlled fury wrapped in political diplomacy. Mrs. Matthews, I think we need to have a conversation. I was already dressed, sitting in my apartment with coffee and the morning paper spread before me. The Seattle Times had run a small item about funding changes affecting local political education initiatives. Nothing dramatic, but enough to signal that word was spreading. Senator, I'm surprised to hear from you directly. Cut the pleasantries. You've just destroyed 3 years of carefully built programming because my daughter hurt your feelings at a wedding reception. I set down my coffee cup. Senator, your daughter didn't hurt my feelings. She revealed her character. There's a significant difference. Character. His laugh was bitter. You've been living a lie for over a decade, letting everyone believe you're some struggling widow while you manipulate people's lives from behind the scenes. And you want to lecture my family about character. The attack was more direct than I'd expected. I've never lied to anyone about my circumstances. I simply chose not to broadcast my private affairs. Bullshit. You let Victoria offer you charity assistance while knowing you could buy and sell our entire family. That's not discretion, Catherine. That's deception. I walked to my window, watching Seattle's morning commuters begin their daily routines. People with honest jobs, straightforward relationships, lives uncomplicated by the kind of power games being played at higher levels. Senator, your daughter married my son under false pretenses. She researched him like a target, investigated my finances without permission, and publicly humiliated me at their wedding. If you want to discuss deception, let's start there. Victoria made a mistake, one comment at a stressful event, and you're destroying my life's work. Your life's work built on my foundation's money. The silence stretched between us before he spoke. Again, his voice dropping to something more dangerous. Catherine, you have no idea what you've started. The Ashford family has been in Seattle politics for 30 years. We have relationships, connections, obligations. You can't just cut funding and walk away clean. Is that a threat, Senator? It's a reality check. Political money doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are people who expect certain outcomes from their investments. When those expectations aren't met, there are consequences. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What kind of consequences? The kind that involve very thorough investigations into foundation activities, tax audits, questions about whether your charitable status has been properly maintained, scrutiny of every financial decision you've made over the past decade. He was right, and we both knew it. Political retaliation was a specialty in this city, and the Ashford family had the connections to make my life very difficult. You're saying I should restore funding to avoid political harassment. I'm saying you should consider whether your wounded pride is worth destroying both our families. After he hung up, I sat in the silence of my apartment, feeling the weight of 12 years of careful planning, suddenly vulnerable to political warfare. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Mom, we need to talk. Victoria's parents want to meet with you. I closed my eyes, knowing that everything was about to get much worse before it got better. That afternoon, I drove to the Ashford Estate on Mercer Island. The same beautiful grounds where Victoria had called me a burden now felt like hostile territory. Diane Ashford met me at the door, her previous politeness replaced by barely controlled desperation. Catherine, thank you for coming. I know this situation has gotten out of hand. She led me to the same sitting room where wedding photos from 2 days ago still decorated the mantel. Victoria was there with Michael, both looking like they hadn't slept. Senator Ashford stood by the fireplace in full political mode. Catherine, he began without preamble, we need to find a way to resolve this situation that works for everyone. I took the offered seat, noting how they'd positioned themselves around the room. Victoria and Michael on the sofa across from me, Diane in a chair to my left, the senator controlling the space from his standing position. It was a classic power arrangement designed to make me feel outnumbered. What kind of resolution did you have in mind? Victoria spoke for the first time. I've prepared a formal apology letter, a public statement acknowledging my inappropriate comments and expressing my deep respect for family values. She handed me a typed document. The letter was professionally crafted, hitting all the right notes about misunderstandings and family unity. It was also completely meaningless. Victoria, do you remember what you said to your college roommate about researching my son before you started dating him? Her face went white. Michael turned to stare at his wife. What is she talking about? It's not what it sounds like, Victoria said quickly. According to my sources, you specifically researched unmarried men with successful careers and aging mothers who might need financial assistance. Michael wasn't a romantic interest. He was a financial strategy. The room went completely silent. Michael's face cycled through confusion, realization, and something that looked like heartbreak. Is that true? He asked his wife quietly. Victoria looked around the room desperately. Michael, relationships are complicated. Yes, I did research, but that doesn't mean my feelings aren't real. You researched my mother's vulnerability so you could exploit it. I researched your family situation so I could be helpful. Senator Ashford intervened. This is exactly the kind of personal attack that's clouding the real issues here. I looked at him with new clarity. Senator, your daughter's character problems aren't personal attacks. They're the reason the Matthews Foundation can't continue supporting your institute. One mistake by a family member doesn't invalidate years of legitimate educational work. It does when that mistake reveals a fundamental misalignment of values. Diane Ashford leaned forward. Catherine, we're prepared to offer you a formal role in the Institute. Board position, advisory capacity, whatever, would make you comfortable continuing the partnership. The offer was desperate and transparent. They needed the foundation money more than they'd admitted. Mrs. Ashford, you're offering me influence over an organization that exists primarily to advance your husband's political career. Why would I want that responsibility? Because Senator Ashford said, dropping his diplomatic mask entirely, the alternative is very unpleasant for everyone involved. There it was, the naked threat I'd been expecting. Explain that. Federal tax audits, state charity commission investigations, public scrutiny of every foundation decision, questions about whether you've been using charitable resources for personal vendettas. He stepped closer. Your son's employer will receive anonymous tips about potential ethics violations. His security clearance will be questioned. Your daughter-in-law's immigration status will be reviewed. Victoria didn't have immigration issues, but the threat was clear. They would attack anyone connected to me. Catherine, he continued, I've spent 30 years building political relationships in this state. I can make your life very complicated, or I can make it very comfortable. Your choice. I looked around the room at these people who'd tried to manipulate my family, failed, and now resorted to direct threats. Michael sat frozen, finally understanding what kind of family he'd married into. Senator, let me make sure I understand. You want me to restore funding to your institute, accept your daughter's meaningless apology, and pretend this entire situation never happened. In exchange, you'll refrain from using your political connections to harass my family. That's a reasonable summary. I stood up, smoothing my simple black dress. I have a counter-proposal. The room tensed. You have 48 hours to publicly withdraw your daughter's marriage to my son. Announce irreconcilable differences, whatever saves face. In exchange, I won't destroy your political career with the information I have about your institute's actual activities. Victoria gasped. Michael stared at me in shock. Senator Ashford's face went red with fury. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Because what you don't understand, Senator, is that while you've been building political relationships, I've been building something much more powerful. I walked toward the door, then turned back. I've been building evidence 48 hours. As I left the Ashford estate, I realized I'd just declared war on one of Seattle's most connected political families. The question was whether I had the resources to win a fight this dangerous. My phone rang before I reached my car. Daniel Rodriguez, my financial advisor. Catherine, we have a problem. Someone's initiated a federal audit of the Matthews Foundation. This isn't coincidence. I looked back at the estate where the Ashford family was undoubtedly planning their next move. Daniel, it's time to activate the contingency plans we discussed, all of them. Are you sure once we do this, there's no going back? I thought about Victoria's cruel dismissal, her calculated manipulation of my son, her father's threats against my family. I'm sure. Let's show them what a real burden looks like. The Seattle Times front page story ran exactly 47 hours after my ultimatum. The headline read, Ashford Institute under federal investigation for misuse of charitable funds. Below it, a smaller headline, anonymous whistleblower provides evidence of political money laundering. I sat in my Capitol Hill apartment reading the story over my morning coffee while rain drummed against the windows. 3 months of careful documentation had finally seen daylight. Every misappropriated dollar, every political contribution disguised as educational programming, every violation of charitable tax status that Senator Ashford thought was buried in complex paperwork. My phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke at 6 a.m. The first call came from Daniel Rodriguez. Catherine, it's done. The federal audit has been redirected to focus on the Ashford Institute instead of the Matthews Foundation. Your documentation was bulletproof. The second call was from Judge Torres. Catherine, the foundation board has fielded interview requests from every major news outlet in the Pacific Northwest. How do you want to handle this? The third call was from Michael. Mom, I need to see you now. He arrived 30 minutes later, still in yesterday's clothes, eyes red from what looked like a sleepless night. Behind him stood Victoria, but this wasn't the polished political wife from 3 days ago. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her makeup smeared, her carefully styled hair falling around her face in defeat. Mom, Michael said without preamble, Victoria told me everything. I set down my coffee cup and waited. She told me about researching our family before we met, about the private investigators she hired to look into your finances, about her parents pushing her to marry someone who could provide security for their political ambitions. Victoria stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. I told him about the plan to get you to move in with us so we could gradually gain control over your assets. The confession hung in the air between us like smoke. And, I asked quietly, Michael ran his hands through his hair. And I told her I was filing for annulment. The marriage was based on fraud, and I have documentation to prove it. Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. Catherine, please, my family is destroyed. Daddy's career is over. The Institute is finished. Our house is being seized as collateral for legal fees. I looked at this young woman who'd called me a burden, researched my son like prey, and tried to manipulate her way into my resources. 3 days ago, she'd been flush with arrogance and political connections. Now she was begging. Victoria, what exactly are you asking me for? Help. Some kind of mercy. I made terrible choices, but my parents are losing everything because of this investigation. Your parents are losing everything because they committed federal crimes while using charitable money. That's not my fault. But you could make it stop. You have influence with the foundation board, with the people who provided the evidence. Michael stepped between us. Victoria, stop, just stop. He turned to me with eyes that held equal parts exhaustion and clarity. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Of course. Did you know what Victoria was when I started dating her? The question I'd been dreading. I looked at my son, at the man I'd raised to value honesty above everything else. No, Michael, I suspected she was more interested in wealth than she was letting on, but I had no idea about the systematic targeting or the investigation of our family. I learned most of it after the wedding. But you could have told me about the foundation sooner, about your actual resources. I could have made more informed decisions. He was right, and we both knew it. Yes, I could have. I chose not to because I wanted you to build your own life, your own success without the complication of family money. I thought I was protecting you. From what? From exactly what happened. from people who would see you as a path to wealth rather than as a person worth loving. Victoria spoke from behind Michael. I did love him, I still do. The money was part of it at first, but my feelings became real. Victoria, I said gently, love doesn't research someone's vulnerabilities before the first date. Love doesn't hire investigators to violate their privacy. Love doesn't publicly humiliate their family at a wedding reception. She had no answer for that. Michael sat heavily in my armchair. So what happens now? The annulment goes through Victoria's family faces federal charges, and we all pretend none of this happened. I walked to my window, looking out at the city where I'd spent 12 years building something meaningful while hiding in plain sight. The rain was letting up, and patches of blue sky appeared between gray clouds. Michael, what happens now is that you get to decide who you want to be going forward. You can be bitter about the deception, or you can be grateful that you discovered the truth before it was too late. I turned back to face them both. Victoria, what happens to you now depends entirely on the choices you make next. What choices? She asked desperately. You can spend the next few years fighting federal charges while blaming everyone else for your situation. Or you can cooperate fully with the investigation, take responsibility for your actions, and try to rebuild something honest from the wreckage. And if I cooperate, then maybe eventually you'll become the person Michael thought he was marrying. The silence stretched between us until my phone rang. Senator Patricia Williams' name appeared on the screen. Catherine, I'm calling with an update. Senator Ashford has agreed to a plea arrangement. He's resigning from office and cooperating fully with the federal investigation in exchange for reduced charges. I looked at Victoria, whose face had gone pale, and his family. Mrs. Ashford will face conspiracy charges, but likely avoid prison time if she testifies honestly. Victoria Ashford will be required to pay restitution for the private investigation costs, but will avoid criminal charges if she provides full documentation of her activities. After hanging up, I relayed the information to Michael and Victoria. It's over, Victoria asked. The legal part will be over soon. The personal part is just beginning. 6 months later, I received an invitation that surprised me. Victoria, now living in a modest apartment in Bellingham and working as a paralegal, was hosting a small dinner for Michael as he finalized their divorce. The note was handwritten, Catherine, I know I have no right to ask, but I've learned things about myself these past months that I think you'd want to know. Not because I'm asking for anything, but because I owe you the truth about what your son meant to me, if you're willing to listen. I drove north on a clear Saturday evening, curious despite myself. Victoria's apartment was small, but clean, decorated with furniture from secondhand shops and photographs of her volunteer work at a local literacy center. She greeted me at the door wearing jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. Without makeup and designer clothes, she looked younger and somehow more real. Thank you for coming, she said simply. Over dinner, she told me about the past 6 months, the humiliation of her father's arrest, the loss of their family home, the discovery that most of her friendships had been based on wealth and status rather than genuine connection. I've been working with a counselor, she said as we finished eating, trying to understand how I became someone who could target another person's family for financial gain. What have you learned? That I was raised to see relationships as the transactions, love as a commodity, security as something you take from others rather than build for yourself. She cleared our plates, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to take care of herself. I did love Michael, she continued. Not at first, maybe not even when we married, but somewhere in the middle it became real. That's what made losing him so devastating. What makes you think you lost him? Because I proved I wasn't trustworthy, because I hurt his family, because I showed him that my love had conditions attached. I studied her face looking for traces of the manipulative woman who'd researched my son and called me a burden. Victoria, can I ask you something? Anything. If you could go back to that wedding reception knowing what you know, now what would you do differently? She was quiet for a long time. I would have introduced you as the woman who raised the man I was learning to love. I would have thanked you for sharing him with me, and I would have meant every word. There was something in her voice that I recognized, the sound of someone who'd lost everything false and was trying to build something true. Victoria, there's something you should know. Michael has been asking about you. Her eyes widened. What kind of asking? the kind that suggests he's wondering if the person he's been missing is the woman who targeted him or the woman who's been volunteering at literacy centers for 6 months. What did you tell him? I told him that only you could answer that question. 3 weeks later, I attended another wedding, smaller this time in a community garden in Bellingham with 30 guests instead of 200. Victoria wore a simple white dress she'd bought at a department store, and Michael looked at her the way a person looks at someone they've chosen freely without reservation or doubt. The ceremony was honest in a way their first wedding hadn't been. When they exchanged vows, Victoria promised to earn his trust daily rather than assuming she deserved it. Michael promised to see her for who she was becoming rather than punishing her for who she'd been. When it came time for family toast, I stood and raised my glass. To Michael and Victoria, I said, who've learned that real love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about choosing someone brave enough to become worthy of the love they're given. Later, as we cleaned up from the reception, Victoria approached me carrying a small wrapped package. I have something for you, she said. Inside was a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten pages. It's a record of everyone I contacted during my investigation of your family, every lie I told, every manipulation I attempted. I thought you should know exactly what you were forgiving. I flipped through pages of meticulous documentation, a complete confession written in Victoria's careful handwriting. Why give this to me now? Because forgiveness without truth isn't really forgiveness, it's just pretending. And because I want you to know that when I call you family now, I understand what that word actually means. I closed the journal and looked at this woman who'd tried to use my son for financial security and had instead found something worth much more. Victoria, what does family mean? She smiled, and for the first time since I'd met her, it was completely genuine. Family means people who see you clearly and choose to love you anyway. People who protect each other not because they have to, but because they want to. People who make each other better instead of just more comfortable. I hugged her than this daughter-in-law who'd earned the title through loss rather than ceremony. As I drove home to Seattle that evening, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us all to this point. A cruel comment at a wedding reception had unraveled carefully constructed lies and forced everyone involved to confront who they really were beneath the performance. The Matthews Foundation continued its work, now funding Victoria's literacy program, among others. Senator Ashford had indeed resigned in disgrace, but the Ashford Institute's legitimate educational programs had been absorbed by other organizations and continued under proper oversight. Michael had learned the difference between privacy and secrecy, understanding why I'd maintained one while rejecting the other. Victoria had discovered that earning love was more satisfying than manipulating for it. And I had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give your family is the truth, even when it's painful, especially when it sets everyone free to choose authentic relationships over convenient ones. The rain had stopped completely by the time I reached my Capitol Hill apartment. Looking up at the clear night sky, I realized I was no longer invisible by design or burdened by accusation. I was simply Catherine Matthews, mother, philanthropist, woman who'd learned that real power isn't about controlling outcomes, but about loving people enough to let them choose their own truths. And that, I thought as I climbed the stairs to my modest apartment, was exactly the burden I'd always wanted to carry.